Good morning.
Good morning.
What a great group of people out on an early Sunday morning. Thanks for coming out to hear us talk about the future of education, of higher education in particular. And I thought we might start, if you would say a few words, Ruth, about why higher education has become the object of such criticism in the last few years. It seems like every time we open the paper or open a website that higher education is a target.
Well, I suppose that I'm not one who believes it to be as dire as some think. After all, we live in a time when institutions are generally targeted.
Yes.
With intense criticism. People are very concerned about government, which fails them. They're concerned about religion, which is a source of all kinds of unexpected things.
Yes.
They're concerned about institutions in general that seem to be failing. By contrast, it seems to me that education is kind of a case apart. People want more of it.
Mm-hmm.
They want it to be cheaper, more accessible, but they definitely admire education and want their children to have the best education. They want to be a part of it, with good reason.
Yes.
I think the history of higher education in particular has been phenomenal. When you think about how access has expanded, truly, how the population has benefited from research in higher education, and everybody knows that. I mean, you know that there are fewer people dying from strokes, it's in part because of what education has wrought. So I don't think it's so much that, I don't think we should be feel ourselves immune to criticism, because there is much to criticize about what we do.
Yes.
But at the same time, I think we're in a very privileged position in education to provide something of use to society. We've just got to be very careful to do it with the highest level of integrity, with much greater access and quality control, and to keep pushing the boundaries of trying to do things that benefit civil society. But I'm not worried so much about the criticism.
It's interesting. I a few years ago became increasingly worried, partly because of the cost escalation and the discussion around student debt, which I'm sure we'll have a few things to say about this morning, and also because of the virulence of some critics who are questioning whether anybody should really want to go even to a great school like Brown, even to a great school like Wesleyan, that college isn't worth it. And so a few years ago I started to look back at the history of higher education in the United States. Like you, I've spent my scholarly time on French things mostly, but I really thought to look back on how universities and colleges have responded to criticism. And so I've written this little book called Beyond the University, Why Liberal Education Matters. And when I was doing the research for it, I really found that the kinds of criticisms we hear today, many of them are criticisms that people have made of higher education since the founding fathers, right? That Ben Franklin used to mock Harvard for all it giving you is a veneer of sophistication and learning how to walk out backwards from a drawing room. And this is a skill they still focus on, I think. But on the other side, you have figures like Jefferson who emphasize that, just as you did in your remarks, that education, higher education, because it's focused on the pursuit of inquiry and knowledge, can be enormously useful to civil society. In fact, if we don't have it, we are likely to be much more at risk of tyranny and of injustice. And so I've been going around the country now talking about the importance in the United States not of education for its own sake, but education as a social good, That is, in America, I think we've had this tension between utilitarians and the purists for a couple of hundred years. And it's the tension between them that works out so well, so that it matters to you that translational research at Brown or at Princeton or at even at Harvard, the translational research involving basic science will not just give you sophistication, it will give you results that make an enormous difference for our citizens. Now, at Brown, you oversaw a spectrum of study from professional schools to the undergraduate realm. How do you, as a president, how do you do that? I mean, I've been always at small places. You know, Wesleyan is almost all undergraduates. When you are overseeing an institution as complex as Brown, where you have people engaging in very specific professional research and others just trying out things for the first time, how do you hold that together as an institution?
Well, you know, I'm a big advocate of the university governance system. One of the things that makes universities, I'm convinced of this, makes universities so successful and so long-lived is that we have a very different model of governance. Unlike the corporation, where the CEO is very powerful and can mandate all kinds of things with the oversight of a board, which may or may not be engaged. In a university, if you are a president of a university, you have to draw into the decision-making process the faculty in particular, yes. The board, and even students. Mm-hmm. The consequence of this is that we tend not to veer off radically in particular directions. The process of formulating what you're going to do, the choices you make, tend to be driven by a consensus. Occasionally, a president can strike out in a particular direction. I was very fearful when I was president of Smith College about whether or not we'd be able to create an engineering program right. in a women's college, for example, right. Because it just seems so odd, a thing to do in a women's college. But you can influence those kinds of things periodically. But by and large, I think you're guided by the fact that English professors and French professors are going to have something to say about whether or not you're spending all of your resources in science and yes. technology. Right. And by and large, people in engineering and medicine and law are going to have their own thoughts about the humanists running rampant.
As we tend to do.
As we happily tend to do. And so on. And you know, we've all been a part of those incredible faculty members where the fights are intense and you're trying to sort out what you're actually going to do. And my belief is that tension is very good for us. It's good for the country. So we end up doing things that are very sensible, in the end, pretty sensible things. So I tended to believe as president that I should be guided by good ideas. I should protect good ideas from people trying to protect their own turf. But by and large, the decision as to whether or not you should fund a new building for music, right. As opposed to some other thing, really should reside in the center. Yeah. And you know, I remember, I shouldn't tell this story here because it's really the wrong city to tell it in. But I remember the music department. This was not at Brown. The music department coming in as a delegation and saying we need a new music building. You know, we listened to the discussion, yeah. and finally somebody in the room said, "Why on earth would we give you a building? You don't bring any research money into the university." That did not down well.
You musicians were not happy.
Well, the campus was not happy.
Yeah.
Because if
Right.
one is reduced to making decisions based on who has the most money, what is a university to become?
It'll become like the government then.
So it's so nonsensical
Yeah.
that finally that has to be overturned, as it was, and
Yeah.
they got a new building.
So maybe we could talk a little bit about the engineering decision at Smith, because I think for me, it's an interesting model of how education is evolving. And Smith College, a great women's college that has deep roots in the liberal arts and a commitment to liberal education from its inception, opens an engineering program. And when you started it, you probably had no engineers on the faculty yet, and yet you have to have it approved in that governance mode that you just described. So could you tell us a little bit, because I think it's indicative of what the future of education might be, how did Smith evolve in this way and still think it's committed to the liberal arts, now including engineering?
Well, we have a wonderful thing that we care a lot about in universities, and that is our mission. And sometimes we stray, we get a bit far from it, and it becomes who's winning in football. But
Wesleyan, by the way.
but by and large, we keep coming back to the mission.
Yeah.
And for a women's college that has changed so much because women are now admitted to universities that they were previously excluded from, women's colleges have to think hard about what a woman can do today. It's not the same as when Barbara Bush was there. So the question is, what does society need? Well, pretty clear that we have a crisis in engineering and some technical fields because women choose less frequently to stay in those fields.
Yes.
And so in the coming years, unless we attract minorities and women to those professions in greater numbers, then the country simply can't be competitive. So we thought, well, let's model how we can attract women to engineering.
Yes.
So the idea was to create a unique kind of engineering program that defined what engineering in the future could be, and therefore could attract women. At the heart of this, without getting too arcane, at the heart of this was the notion that ABET, the accrediting agency for engineering, had already said that engineering education doesn't have to be the same today.
Right.
You don't have to have a lockstep curriculum in the first year of calculus and chemistry and physics, which is a deterrent to many students when they start engineering. So we wanted to have a different curriculum and to test whether or not that worked. So that's how it came into being.
That's interesting. At Wesleyan, we are experimenting with adding more design and engineering into the curriculum for similar reasons. And I'm of the view that liberal education in the United States isn't about the specific disciplines you teach. It's about the way you teach any discipline. And so you can teach music as if it was a technical field and teach it in a vocational manner as one does at a conservatory. Or one could teach it in that liberal arts context where you're looking at it conceptually and contextually. And I think that schools that are devoted to liberal education don't have a choice between vocationalism and a broad conceptual education. They have this ability to take a broad and conceptual approach to fields that have extraordinary vocational and social good potential. And I think that the governance model you describe is keeps that change slow.
Yes.
Because it's the faculty who are going to approve the new field, and the new field is not yet represented on the faculty. So there's the fear that a new field will take precious resources away from the existing ones. But insofar as the program can be broad and conceptual and show interconnections between, let's say, design and other fields, or engineering and other fields, or the study of philosophy and other fields, that should find good soil at liberal arts institutions, universities, and colleges alike. I think it was that Dewey who made this point in the middle of the 20th century, that a liberal education in the United States is not about just acquiring a set of facts in disciplines that are not associated with work. Right? That's not what which was what liberal arts education was in many parts of the world. It really was for people who had the leisure to come and think about things that were disconnected from their working lives. I think that what I found so powerful about this American tradition of liberal education is that we don't have to disconnect the humanities and sciences and arts from our working lives. In fact, we want to connect them to our working lives because that will make them more meaningful, and that will make our working lives more productive and purposeful. So I think that it's this false choice between the pragmatic and liberal education that is animating some of the criticism today, but I don't think we have to make that choice. I think that a pragmatic liberal education is very much possible in this country.
But perhaps I'm wrong about this, but somehow I don't think that those who launch that criticism can really be sincere in that criticism, because if it were so impractical, the demand would be much less. There's nothing like the market, as they say, for determining whether or not you have a good product. And when colleges and universities cease being relevant and practical, people will go away. Now, there's this big debate right now about whether or not online education is going to be so practical that it's going to essentially make institutions like ours irrelevant, and so on. But I think that that is very unlikely to happen.
Yes.
I think that some want to use online education as a wedge to get us to reduce prices and to change culture, like eliminate tenure, which is, some people really think tenure is a bad thing. I don't. But they think that if universities only eliminated tenure, and we had, these peripatetic teachers wandering around from institution to institution, that labor would be cheap and the price would go down. It's true that would drive the cost of education down. But here's the thing that we shouldn't lose about universities. Where in the world is there a site for rigorous debate leading to discovery? There is no other place where that can actually happen. Tenure facilitates that in an extraordinary way, because as presidents, we go to faculty meetings and we have faculty who can resist idiotic things that we want to do.
This is a problem, I think, actually.
This is not a problem. It's the saving grace of the system. We have faculty who can stand up to government. We have faculty who can stand up to despots. I argue this passionately because, I grew up at a time when I had no rights at all.
Yes.
Where I not only suffered discrimination, but my country told me that I could never do anything. I couldn't be a full citizen. I couldn't vote. I couldn't matter at all.
Yes.
And so there was a place in this country for the challenge to that, just as there was in the days of slavery. There was a place to challenge the standing views of humanity. And so I think we protect universities because it's still that kind of place.
Yes.
We err from time to time by trying to shut down free speech, but it never is successful in universities, ever successful, because it's a thing that really, it's the engine for everything. valuable that takes place in a university setting. So I think that, I think what we have and what we have to treasure in the liberal arts tradition, more than anything else, is that you have these fields coexisting in the same intense environment, creating jarring interactions that lead to new information, new insights, new discoveries, and that lead to overturning convention and often overturning very, very evil policies.
Yes, it's so interesting that you frame it that way. I was really struck by this Jeffersonian devotion to education as a vehicle for freedom in the United States, knowing very well, of course, that when I talk about Jefferson, Sally Hemings may come to mind more quickly than the word freedom. And Jefferson, a man of enormous prejudices, and not just prejudices of his time, he added extras. But what I was so interested in looking at David Walker and then later Frederick Douglass and W.B. Du Bois is that notion that through free speech, inquiry, and scholarship, freedom could be acquired was taken up by African and African-American intellectuals in this country as their vehicle for freedom. David Walker, in a pamphlet that earned him the death penalty, right, he says, I would crawl on my hands and knees to sit at the feet of a learned man. And he says that against Jefferson, because Jefferson says, well, you can't be a learned man because you're black. And David Walker says, I will show that Jefferson is wrong by acquiring the education he denies me. I will show that the governments of the states are wrong by acquiring the education you say that people like me can't have. And when W.E.B. Du Bois focuses on what's the most powerful thing about education, he says it's power, right? That you are empowered by higher education, and that it's education that is the best way to protect our freedom. Now, for me, this was really exciting to see that thread taken up by those who struggled against convention and struggled for civil rights. I wonder if you would say a little bit, just autobiographically, about how education changed your life. I mean, you growing up in Texas and now, I guess, living there again, but your journey through and with education has been really extraordinary. I wonder if you would say a few words about the transformative impact on you.
Well, that's a very long story, but given my age, I mean, it's very long. But, you know, one of the problems that I have in our country today is how we live such separate lives. Mm-hmm. Middle-class people who have no concept of what it's like really to be desperately poor. Yeah. Wealthy people who only associate with other wealthy people. Mm-hmm. But, you know, when I was growing up in Fifth Ward in Houston, that was the only world that I knew. What did I know? I knew that I could never aspire to any kind of profession. Mm-hmm. I knew that I couldn't go downtown and sit in a restaurant. I knew that I couldn't speak in any uppity way to a white person. I knew that people thought I was ugly and unworthy. That's the life that I lived. But there was a bright spot, and that is in my neighborhood. There was a community center, and the community center had books. And we could go and take books out and read them. And my goodness, I started to read and I started to understand that the little world I lived in wasn't really the world. It was just a tiny cell in which I lived. So learning that was the single most important thing in my life. Yes. That my life was not circumscribed by my economic conditions and by the fact that my parents had 8th grade education, nor by the fact that a lot of people hated me for no reason that I could really understand as a tiny kid. So the simple answer is that education taught me to be more open-minded, to actually wait to learn about people and not to presume that the people who hated me were evil just because they hated me or just because they didn't know me. It taught me to care about the fact that the world was a complex place, that I was, just as I was hearing, I'd walk down the street and, you know, people would pass by and yell nigger when I was walking to school, but in my own neighborhood, I knew there was just as much hatred as what I was experiencing from whites. Education taught me to really think differently about the world, and to look, to try to understand different cultures and different peoples around the world. I thought I could learn from that, and that was the single biggest thing in my life. To learn that simple message was fantastic. And of course, that kept me in school for a long time, all the way through the PhD, and just the fact that there was so much there to learn, and things that I could in fact do. But I have to say, it took me an enormous amount of time to overcome the idea that I could actually do something. Because that was so deeply embedded in me that I thought, well, you know, maybe I could be a secretary, which would be a wonderful, in my family, that would have been a fantastic thing. And then I'd go a little farther and I would say, well, maybe I could be a teacher. And then next, well, maybe I could do this, or maybe, but I couldn't embrace the entire idea at a time because it was too big an idea in a way. But, you know, eventually I just, you know, kept going and kept learning.
It's interesting, as you tell the story of your own journey, of your own life, I think about that community center and the opportunity to get books or to interact with other people who are reading. And for me, that is one of the important features of online education. So very counterintuitively, I guess, I signed Wesleyan up without it was the summertime, so I couldn't consult with the faculty. Don't tell anybody, don't tell them. So we signed up with Coursera to offer these online classes. And I'm not a technologically savvy person, to put it mildly. And I've been teaching regularly ever since the early 80s. I still teach every semester at Wesleyan. And I thought, we ought to try this thing. We probably won't like it. And that's one of the reasons I thought we should try it, to see what we don't like about it so we could resist it. And in fact, I gave a kind of classics, great books class in this good enough books class called the Modern and the Postmodern. And so I think about 100,000 people have signed up for this course in a couple of iterations now through Coursera. It's free. All the texts are free. And I know I have people with PhDs in the class, which scares me because I usually teach freshmen, so I can say anything. I have people, but I also have people in middle schools, and I have people from 100 different countries. And so I guess I don't know this for sure, although I do get communications from many of the students. There are students in Bangladesh, in China, in Nigeria, in Brazil, for whom a course like this is exactly what you described. They see there's a bigger world. And when the students write in at the end of the class, they've written papers to one another, they exchange lots of ideas. When they write in at the end of the class, why was this class important to me? I hear from them some of the same things you hope to hear from your students on campus, that it transformed my life, it opened the world to me. Now I'm reading Baudelaire when I go walking in the woods, or whatever the comments are. And so although I don't think this is going to replace what we do at Brown or at Wesleyan or other schools, I do think it opens our world to more people. And we do at Wesleyan, we do it relatively inexpensively. We don't put a lot of money into high production values because we don't think that's what people are looking for. But I can't tell you how many people wrote and said, what I really would love to do is come there. You know, I want to be there. And we can't do that. We're not going to get bigger. But we can open our world to a much wider group of people who have an appetite for the humanities. And I think, for me, that was really encouraging that I knew there was an appetite for accounting and for computer science at a higher level. But what was really thrilling for me was that there was such an appetite for the books that we love and for the ideas that we wrestle with.
No question. I think that, you know, I'm singularly impressed with this last book of E.O. Wilson, The Meaning of Human Existence. Here's this biologist who's saying, whatever we do as scientists and as technologists, we will never solve our problems.
Right.
Because the integration of human knowledge requires us to think about a host of things that scientists can't do alone. And, you know, my own, you know, obviously my field's French, but maybe that's not so obvious, actually. Because people ask me about it all the time, what was wrong with me that I chose French? But I think it's very important to understand that the humanities, the arts and humanities, don't belong to some elitist group.
Right.
Which is, you know, one of the things that I have tried to communicate, especially in very poor communities.
Yes.
Where parents have the inclination to send children toward so-called technical fields where they can get a job. Mm-hmm. And I'm there arguing, no. Mm-hmm. You know, knowledge as a whole should just be embraced, mm-hmm. because you can learn a host of things from, you know, a particular vantage point.
Yes.
And that can be really all your child needs. But the thing that really, my message is, you know, in my story, that I grew up in a black neighborhood. I only knew black people, obviously. Only went to black schools because they weren't integrated. And then I went to a black college. Yep. And I landed at this black college, which seemed to me to be a very bizarre place, because they taught things like opera. And I remember I had to take a music appreciation course, and this very odd man, who was very passionate about the subject, made us listen to classical music and opera. And, you know, I was so outraged by this, because what did this have to do with me?
Right.
And mine? I thought it was ridiculous. But it's really courses like that that helped me most, mm-hmm. because we ought to all be educated as far afield of who we are as possible. Because the only way to know the world is by certainly learning about yourself, but getting outside of who we are and what we've done, and learning to appreciate everything else in the world and the value of it. Because once you get the fact that we aren't all that, okay? That China has centuries, mm-hmm. Millennia of culture that are so deep and rich, and you know, and so until you get that fact, you can make all kinds of very serious human mistakes.
Yes.
Mistakes in regard to other people. And I still believe that the biggest problem we have, frankly, it's not what technology has not produced for us yet, because it's going to do that. It's going to do that and so much more, because it's escalating. The pace of invention mm-hmm. is just escalating enormously. But what are we still missing? What we're missing is this connection.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is what is bedeviling the world and causing all kinds of things, and could ultimately lead to our extinction as a species.
Absolutely.
So what we need to do is allow the humanities and the arts in to help us understand who we are and who our many, many neighbors are across the world. Because if we don't finally, in the end, get that, then the consequences will not be good.
Well, it's so important, and I'm reminded of another hero of mine that I write about in this book. I keep mentioning this book because my publisher says I'm supposed to sign some afterwards outside. So Ralph Waldo Emerson, who when he at an address at Harvard said to the students, you know, the point of college is not to drill us into knowledge. It's not so we memorize things, and he thought that was true in the middle of the 1800s. It's clearly true today when any of us with our phones can answer questions more quickly than even really smart professors. But that's not the point of sitting with a really smart professor, is getting information. Emerson, the point is to animate the world, to see the world as more alive. As you said, with the opera course, I had a similar experience with Carl Schursky at Princeton. He had a special class on Tristan, and I thought, why would I go to such a class? You know, I'm not from that background. We don't listen to opera. My father was a furrier. You know, he would probably hit me if I was saying I was going to the opera. But sitting there with Carl and hearing a great teacher open this world, suddenly there was more music in my life. There was more things to be aware of. And for Emerson, this was the point of a college education, right? Was suddenly that you paid attention to things and they were more vivid for you. And you, in turn, had a richer and more dynamic life because you were more alive in a world that was more alive. And I think that, I'm sure you've seen this in the classroom as have I, students who come in, you know, they're putting up with the humanities course, or they have their baseball cap pulled down, and they're really cool. And
this doesn't happen at Brown.
Yeah. Well, at Wesleyan, it happens in spades, you know, and then suddenly, whether it's reading Du Bois or reading William James or listening to music, suddenly a piece of the world that they thought they could ignore or just simply did ignore suddenly is alive to them. And their lives are bigger, right? I mean, I'm sure that's why you come out to a discussion like this. Your lives are bigger because your education has opened more parts of the world to you and opened more parts of yourself to the world. That's a great gift.
But it's also very practical, because when I think about what might have happened to me, you know, from
Yes.
a horrible beginning, honestly, just when I think about the life I've lived and the people I've known,
Yes.
you know, all over the world, I can't imagine that being stolen from anybody.
Yep.
And not to have that richness in your life is a form of theft in a way, because the world is grand and its potential is immense, and the joy that we can have in being a part of it is unlimited, provided that we are open. And you know, my students sometimes say, especially minority students, they come to me and say, Ruth, I'm so tired of explaining myself to people. You know, I'm just fed up with people who just don't get, who don't get who I am. And I always say to them, you won't get any sympathy from me, because, yeah, I talk like that to them. Because you are here on earth to explain who you are to people.
Yes.
And to receive from them an understanding of who they are. That basic thing that we do as human beings, which, of course, the humanities helps us, you know, immensely to do. So.
Absolutely, and I do think what you said about those who would deny this opportunity to people, it is a form of theft. I mean, I think that's so important, because beneath a lot of the criticisms we hear today of higher education, that it's not for everybody. You don't have to go because you're from a poor neighborhood. You don't have to go because you're a girl. You don't have to go because you really can just learn how to code, and that'll be fine for you. I do think this is a form of social engineering by existing elites to keep people from acquiring the kinds of information that will make them more critical citizens, more well-rounded human beings. And so I think the defense of the future of higher education is also a defense of our democracy, and which needs defending, as we all know. If you turn on the television and see advertising replacing democracy, we know we need a defense. And I think without education, that defense will be much more difficult. And since it's about democracy, I do think this is the moment in the program where we are ask the audience for questions. And there are folks with microphones who are going to be in each aisle. And if you raise your hand, someone will come up to you with a microphone because we can't really see you all that well with the lights in our eyes. Yes, please.
Thank you. That was wonderful. You have each become most passionate describing a moment in your own educations that would probably be highlighted by those who criticize higher education as a perfect example of useless classes. You know, we tend to measure graduates and schools by how many people get jobs and what their income is. We measure our own economy by GDP, GNP. Other cultures measure national happiness. Mm-hmm. How do you sell? You've said not only did these courses change your life personally, you found joy through these courses, but also that they contributed to who you are as a productive member of society. How do you sell this concept? Not to all the people you need to sell it to, not only politicians, but also parents, students themselves, that it's worthwhile having your world opened, period, full stop.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to say a word about that? How that? I mean, I can answer very quickly because I have a book that sells that idea, and I'll sign it for you twice. No. I do think, I mean, Brown, under Ruth's leadership, had more demand for its seats than almost anything one can imagine. I mean, it really, people are just so eager to participate in the learning community. And I do think one of the sad facts about the critiques you hear is that it ignores the enormous demand from Americans of all walks of life, although we do want more applications from low-income students who don't realize they could go to schools like Wesleyan and Brown for free, but also from all over the world who want to be part of this learning community. And I do think that we have to do a better job of explaining the ways in which these classes and this cluster of educational opportunity has transformed the lives of people, but also created the products, the experiences, and the potential that drives the culture and the economy. I mean, I do think it's enormously pragmatic, and that it's not just about leisure. It's about an expansive world that will lead to more opportunity, cultural opportunity and economic opportunity. So I think it's hard to be, as I would imagine, as president of Brown, to sell too hard because only a certain very small percentage are going to get in, but to sell the idea for other schools, especially public institutions, which have been starved of support. I mean, that I do think is something that people in our positions have to be able to do, to explain it to politicians and to a broader public.
I think, certainly one of the things I've always tried to do, although, I've been privileged to have a comfortable life, but most of the people that I love are still mired below the poverty line. So one of the great blessings to me is to be rooted in that reality still, and to be able to understand what so many different people are seeing in higher education. So what are they seeing? I think most people who look at higher education, who've not been privileged, certainly, see it as a way to be certified as a human being who matters and who can be trusted to do a job. It's an emphasis on that certification element. What we are very poor at doing in higher education is explaining what is behind the veil, because what people see is not really what's going on in education. I've advocated consistently that we have to be better at telling the story of education, what it is that we do, and why it matters. Now, I took it upon myself to go around and talk to corporations about their behavior and what they should be doing to change themselves. And so one of the things that, one of my spiels is that they had better get ready, because the students who are coming along today are not the same people who were driven in the past to sign up with corporations. And therefore, they really need to become broader. They need to focus on more humane issues. They need to understand that there's a place for the humanities in the environment. They need to have a social agenda in order to attract the students who are coming along. And I think I believe that is absolutely true. I think we're seeing that change. In universities, we're seeing already students come through who have that message already. Why do they have it? Because they look at us and they say, well, gee, you're not really doing what you need to for society, okay? And therefore, I have to live my life differently. And I've got to be better than you were about social issues. I have to be better about environmental issues. I have to be better and more critical of certain organized entities that are controlling the world. So I think we need to, so my answer is I think we need to do a much better job of explicating what's actually taking place of value in the academy.
And I do think a lot of major corporations recognize the value of this broad education and hire accordingly. And I sent a copy of this book to the head of human resources at Google, who is a Pomona grad and a history major. And his response was he thinks liberal education is the foundation not only of the company, but of citizenship in this country. And I went off to Google to give a talk about the humanities to mostly software engineers. And they were eager to hear about this and eager to find ways to connect their specific expertise to a broader, more well-rounded education. Is another question?
I have another question right here.
Hi, I have two, but I think they're related to each other. The first is I work in the pre-K to 12 public education system, and I'm interested to hear from you your thoughts on the role of higher education in the fact that the average public school education right now is robbing kids of this experience. Arts are the first thing to go. What kids need to put out every day is not inquiry-based or exploratory, and our policies and the way we fund schools continue to reiterate that getting a job is the first and only goal. And even then, we're not doing such a great job at it. So what do you see as the role of higher ed in changing policies for public schools, changing funding systems for public schools to better focus on a whole experience for children? And then, I guess kind of related, thinking about the future of higher ed, I would love to hear your thoughts on the student debt crisis and the role of higher ed in making it a more accessible experience.
Well, I mean, simple answer in my view, what's the role of higher education? Role of higher education is to do everything possible to improve the situation of, K through 12. I mean, here's where I think this is one of the saddest stories in the history of higher education, frankly, and one that I've been very disappointed by. And that is, I mean, if you want to know part of what the issue has been, is that higher education has separated itself from K through 12 for cultural reasons, and also for other reasons. Look, if you believe in a college or university that your brightest students should be advised not to go into teaching, that is so counter to what we should be doing. I can't even express it. But what I can say confidently is that that's exactly what's happening. It's happening in homes around the country. It's happening in universities and colleges. The idea that somehow to go into teaching is a failure, and seeing teachers as failures. So that's number one. So, the second thing is, look at how schools of education are supported. Very poorly. And look at the number of institutions that have eliminated schools of education. Horrible. This goes directly to the lack of responsibility of boards. Because if you want to know the truth about governance in universities and colleges, the board of trustees holds the power, okay? And for boards to allow that to happen in some of these circumstances is unbelievable to me. Even the most prominent education schools are low on funding because the universities do not put their priority on preparing teachers. And that's exactly, we should regard preparing teachers as the centerpiece of what we do. And then finally, I would say that universities have a tendency to set requirements from high school. And what happens in high school is directly related to the kind of requirements that we set at the university level. So this separation, I described, I had a very unsuccessful inaugural address at Brown. And that's because I chose to talk about this issue of the continuum of education. And I was advocating for universities to see education from kindergarten all the way through graduate school as their realm, and to care about that, the continuum of education, and not just focus on the moment when someone who is a high achiever manages to qualify for university. I think it's going to continue to be the problem unless universities really reverse that, and not cherry pick by sponsoring a school or doing certain limited things, but to really embrace that continuum as something for which we are responsible.
So I would just add very quickly that I think under the guise of accountability, part of what has happened in the K-12 system is creating a culture of conformism through test taking, which has really a negative impact on our student bodies, because when they come to places like ours, they're really eager to find out what the prompt is so they can give the right answer. They've been trained to do that, which is really the opposite of inquiry-based learning. That's just one of a series of deep structural and economic problems in the K-12 system. You did also ask about student debt in higher education. I think it's a responsibility for those of us who can to reduce or eliminate the need for loans at universities like ours. And so, and that's only possible when you have enough resources to make financial aid available as grants rather than loans. I do think that addressing the student debt issue in a coordinated way is crucial for American institutions, especially for large public institutions, and even more importantly, for the for-profit sector, which is responsible for a dramatically disproportionate amount of student debt. But I think as states have withdrawn their public support for higher education across the country, that has been made up for not in increased wages by citizens, because that hasn't happened, but by increased borrowing. And that does undermine confidence in education, because you start off with this great inhibition on your capacity after graduation.
At the same time, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to students not having a huge loan burden, but I think the public ought to get real about this. In terms of, nobody's complaining about the cost of automobiles. Nobody's complaining about the particular ways in which young people today are introduced to the world with spending that is incredible, frankly. And I think that when we accept in higher education the notion that education shouldn't cost very much, I think it's not good for the country, because there is a cost to education. Shouldn't perhaps be as great as it is today, but there is a cost. And when I think about my friends from Fifth Ward who had decided to go for a wonderful car instead of sacrificing to go to college, and see where they are today. I mean, we've got to be speaking truth to young people and to parents about the choices that we are making in our lives. And one of the most important choices to be made is, how are we going to educate our young people, and what value are we going to accord to that, as opposed to the consumption that we see parents very willing to see kids engage in.
Yeah, I think both of us would agree that we don't know very many overpaid professors. That faculty at schools, even fancy places like ours, faculty work extraordinarily hard and have been trained for long periods of time, and their starting salaries and their ending salaries are not exorbitant. And the idea that you could cut the cost of education without decimating the living wages of teachers and faculty, I think, is an illusion, and there are priorities to be set. The priority I've just been given by the folks who run this festival is that we have to stop our conversation. But thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.